Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, and last week Bill started out with the Song of Moses, and that's what we're studying. Moses, being at the end of his life, composed this song or poem, as it may be called, to instruct the children of Israel before he died of all the good things that God had done for him, and warned them about all the bad things that were going to happen to them if they strayed from God. So if we look at the theme of this song, it's God's faithfulness, and a very important purpose was to encourage the children of Israel to remember God's greatness. And like Bill was talking about last week, this was a song that all the children of Israel were supposed to memorize and sing, throughout their lives to remind them. And the bad thing about it was, after a while, they didn't pay much attention to the words of the song. And what he talked about last week was, in the first section, Moses was reminding the children of Israel of all of the good things that God had done to them, or done for them. And we're going to start kind of at verse 15 to kind of pull all the thought together. That's the beginning of Moses reminding them of the things that are going to happen if they fall away from God. So that's where we're going to pick up today. And before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, thank you, Father, for another list. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity to gather here in your church to study from your word. Be with David as he breaks the bread of life unto us. May we be receptive, Father. Retain it, Father, to be better servants for thee. Thankful for your Son Jesus and the love he showed for us on the cross. It's to his name we pray. Amen.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start out by looking at verses 15 through 18. But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked, and thou art waxed fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsake God, which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations provoked they him to anger. They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. Of the rock that begat thee thou art unmindful, and hast forgotten God that formed thee. So basically here, this is being talked about to Israel. And Israel had repaid God for all of the things that he had done for him by basically coming up with a base of apostasy. And Israel's rebellion against God stands in stark contrast to the gracious things that God had done for them. Now, Jeshurun here it's kind of a pet name that's only used about 4 times in the scripture, and it means upright one, uprightness, or righteous nation. And this is a term that Moses is using to describe the children of Israel here. And like I say, it only appears 4 times in the scripture, 3 times here in Deuteronomy, and then 1 time in Isaiah. And this is an honorable name. It's not like a nickname where you're making fun of something. But this is an honorable thing, and an honorable surname that Moses is using here to show that the children of Israel could have a place of honor if they do the things that God wants them to do. So he's describing them as a just and a right nation at this particular time. But the warning is that if they don't continue in their current way, and they move away from God, then this is going to be a problem.
That's why he's a little sarcastic, though, with the way he says it, because he talks about they were upright, but now they're out of shape. They're kind of falling apart. But he's looking into the future.
Well, and they're at this particular point, they're not living the good life, but they know, when you talk about the land of milk and honey, they're going to be living the good life. So there's a comparison here between the children of Israel and Jehovah, both being just and upright and walking in righteousness. Of course, God is righteous all the time, and man is righteous and tries to be righteous most of the time, but oftentimes fails. But God has chosen the children of Israel to be His chosen people and His servant. In Isaiah 44:2, it says, "Thus saith the Lord that made thee and formed thee from the womb, which will help thee. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, thou art Jeshurun, whom I have chosen." So again, we see the same word here being used to describe the children of Israel. And Isaiah is pointing out, they are the ones that are chosen out of all the people in the world. So this is kind of a special name that is given to the children of Israel here because of their holy calling. So we see here that because of the way that they're living, they're going to get themselves in trouble. And this fatness, some of the commentators talk about having an ox, and the ox does a bunch of work, and you keep the ox in shape. But if you let the ox go off and get too fat, they get lazy and they forget what their job is, and they don't do their job very well. So we see here that because of the not wild living, but the riotous living that the children of Israel are going to be doing, they're going to have it too good, and they're going to forget about the things of God. I mean, that talks about us a lot of times today, is when things are going good, we have a tendency sometimes to forget God. But when things are going bad, then we want God to come and help us. And that's not a good situation to be into. And you think about, in the last 20 so years, right after 9/11, all the churches were packed. A lot of people coming to church because they feared for what was going to happen to the nation. Then everything got okay. Everybody kind of forgot about it. And now we're kind of back in a situation where people aren't paying too much attention. So, there's a lot of comparisons between our living today, and, the children of Israel back then. So we need to remember and keep that kind of in mind. So Moses here is foretelling that the children of Israel are going to get themselves into this shape. And this is really a pretty sharp reproof on Moses' part, and telling them that they're going to be fat, and they're going to be overweight and gross, and just forget about God. And you put yourself in the place of the children of Israel at this time. They haven't had it too great. They haven't been to the land of milk and honey yet. They've had a pretty tough time there in the wilderness, and this may not sit too well with them at that particular time. But Moses is telling them what's going to happen in the future, and all of these things that Moses has foretold here, history tells us, and the Bible tells us, that these things have actually happened. That because of their living and becoming fat, they're going to forsake God, their Creator, and the ground of their salvation, that rock of salvation that God is to the children of Israel. And Martin Luther had a quote one time. He said, "A full stomach does not promote piety, for it stands secure and neglects God." And I think that's that kind of sums up what Moses was saying here. Comments about those verses? Okay, let's look at 32 through 16 through 18. I've lost it here. Hang on a minute, 16. Yeah, 19. There we go. All right. "And when the Lord saw it, he abhorred them because of the provoking of his sons and his daughters." So this foolish apostasy the Lord is going to severely visit his people or bring these things down upon. And this visitation is represented here as the consequences of the apostasy that has taken place. And it's not as a punishment already inflicted, but it's simply a resolution which God had formed and would carry out. And one of the things that I think we lose a little bit in the interpretation, changing this from the Hebrew into the Latin, is the emphasis of the words that are used, and the words are written in a future type of tense, but it's a future type of tense as though it has already happened. And we've talked about that in some of the writings in the Old Testament before, that these things are written in such a way that it's a future event, but it's a future event that's sure to happen. So here in verse 19, the determination to reject the degenerate children is announced. And then in 20 and 22, it's going to be further defined and explained. So he saw this adultery of the people and rejected those that followed these idols. Because of God's indignation, he's going to bring down judgment upon the people. And we see here the expression he saw, and this simply serves to bring out the link between the apostasy and the punishment. It all kind of goes together. The apostasy happens, and then the punishment is going to happen. And this is something that God had resolved to do. It's going to happen because God had resolved it to, but it had not yet been carried out, because these things that Moses is foretelling hadn't been talked about yet. So in what follows, Moses puts this resolution into the mouth of the Lord himself in verses 20 through 21. So any comments about that verse?
A lot of scholars actually make a comment about that final phrase about sons and daughters. We don't see that term a lot. We see sons a lot. That's considered kind of unisex. But by saying sons and daughters, he's saying there's no group that is exempt from disobeying. Sin. Everyone's involved here.
Well, and that's a good point, because as we've studied Deuteronomy at particular points, Moses made it clear that there were certain things that were going to happen that was going to affect everybody. Not only he talked about the sons, he always talked about the servants, and even the people that were not necessarily children of Israel, but their servants and things along that line. It was going to affect them also. So the stranger. So he knows when to emphasize and to let people know that some people are not going to be able to escape. It's going to affect everybody. So let's look at verses 20 and 21. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be. For they are a very forward generation, children in whom is no faith. They have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities, and I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. So here in verse 20, the divine purpose contains basically two things. First of all, the negative side, and God is going to hide his face from them, which basically means he's going to withdraw his favor from these people, and he's going to show them what their end is going to be as a result of their apostasy. And what it's going to bring to them, it's going to bring to them evil, and it's going to bring to them their destruction, because they're a perverse nation. And the word that's used in the original text is a moral perversity is what the term actually means. So it's a deep moral type of perversity that we're being talked about here. And then secondly, there's a positive side, because there's going to be a chastisement according to the right of the complete retaliation. So there's going to be there's going to be retaliation on God's part. And the Israelites had really, or were going to excite the jealousy and the vexation of God. And the way that they're going to do this is they're going to go to a non-God, something that only exists in the mind of man, and it's going to be a vanity type of thing. And God is a jealous God, and his jealousy is going to be brought out against the children of Israel. Now, the jealousy of God in verse 21 is not a spirit of pettiness that's prompted by insecurity, but it is righteous indignation caused by the disloyalty that the people have had because to his covenant of grace. I mean, God has taken care of the children of Israel, took care of them in Egypt, took care of them all the time in the wilderness. He fed them, he gave them water, he gave them clothing, he took care of everything that they could possibly want. Now, it might not have been the greatest of everything. It was the basic needs. And then all of a sudden, they get going in a good way, and they turn their face on God. And I mean, God has the right to be indignant about the things that they had done, and just basically threw him out the window for a nothing. And it's not a petty type of situation. God was provoked here because of the actions of the children of Israel. And how this retaliation would manifest itself is not fully defined here, but it's going to be gathered from the conduct of Israel toward the Lord. The longer it goes, the worse it gets, and the more things that's going to happen to the children of Israel, because they have excited this jealousy of God by preferring a non-God. And in the original text, the word that was used there is a nothingness. In other words, there's nothing there. This God doesn't really exist. It has no power. It's something that's in the mind of man, versus the true and the living God, who has demonstrated to the children of Israel time and time again the power that he has, and being their creator and their father. So God absolutely has the right to be indignant about the things that they've done, and they've gone into the place where they are now a foolish nation. They have a rock of their salvation that's proven, and they basically just throw it out the window, and they start following something that's actually not there, and that shows the foolishness of the nation at the time. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen immediately, but this is something that's going to happen over a period of time. And it's not going to happen all of a sudden. It's going to happen over a period of time, and it's going to be a long and extended type of thing. So they're going to be a foolish nation, and they're going to end up being not even a people in the final judgment of Israel.
A lot of folks say this is very much prophecy about the Gentiles, and the fact that in God's final plan, all have access to salvation.
Right. And as you read the different scholars on this event, they point out things all the way through the Bible where these things that Moses has prophesied here has taken place, and then even after Jesus came, there was things that happened that can go be traced back to the prophecy that was put in here. Other comments about that verse? Okay, let's look at verse 22. For a fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn into the lowest hell, and shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains. So here in verse 22, the determination of the Lord with regard to the faithless generation is explained by a threat that the wrath of the Lord is going to be kindled against the children of Israel. And it would basically set the whole world in flames, this just shows the depth of the indignation that God had. I mean, you can't get any worse than the lowest fires of hell and things that will go all the way down to the foundations of the mountain, or basically the foundations of the earth. So this fire kind of in the nose of the Lord is a figurative description of the burning wrath and jealousy that God had. And the fire here signifies, his jealousy, and the sense of the jealousy that God has is kind of like a consuming fire. And, there's nothing worse than the destruction that can happen, with a fire, because there's nothing that fire can't destroy. We talk about in the fire service, we talk about fire-resistant buildings. Well, fire-resistant buildings doesn't have anything to do with not burning. The Emmons building was a fire-resistant building, and people got killed in that fire. But there's nothing that fire can't destroy. They used to say that the only thing that wouldn't burn was pig iron underwater. And nowadays they've even got a fire that can burn pig iron underwater. So fire is probably one of the most destructive things that God has ever invented. So it's going to go to the lowest regions of the earth, and all the way down into hell. So it's a pretty good indignation on the part of the Lord. Of course, we know that in the end, fire is going to consume the earth and all of the things that that go along with it. And people back in that time, they had a pretty good respect for fire, because one good fire could destroy all their vegetation and things along that line. So this was something that the children of Israel, when you start talking about fire, should really have a pretty good understanding. And this is not something that God has thrown out there lightly. This is a picture of the judgment which is going to befall the children of Israel, and if they fall away from the true and the living God. So the thought here is weakened by the assumption that this is some type of hyperbole. It's not. This is a solid description of the things that are going to happen, and the words are intended to foretell of a particular judgment that's going to be a total and universal judgment that's going to happen to the children of Israel. And we know that did actually happen. So this is not something that Moses was just throwing out there to try to scare them. This is something that they needed to take to heart, because eventually it was going to come to pass. Not necessarily in the current generation that Moses writes this for, but in the future. And that's why he wanted this song to go all the way through the generations, and for all, to continually learn this, to learn this song. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 23. I will heap mischiefs upon them. I will spin mine arrows upon them. So God here promises, he doesn't threaten, he promises his people that every species of calamity that you can think of is going to befall the children of Israel. And it's going to be one calamity after another. And they're going to actually mention some in the next verse. So he's represented here as an enemy to the Jews, and having bent his bow and arrow like an enemy, and raining down terror on the children of Israel. And if you look at the history of how this actually happened, God himself didn't do this, but he had other nations as his instrument that rained these things down on the children of Israel. And he said here, he has a quiver that's full of arrows. So there's a lot of different things that God has that he's going to be able to use to exempt his judgment upon the children of Israel. And these arrows here are pretty much expounded here in verse 24. So let's look at it. It says, they shall burn with hunger and devoured with burning heat and with bitter destruction. I will also send the teeth of the beast upon them with the poison of serpents of the dust. So here basically he's mentioning the evils that are going to befall upon the children of Israel. They're going to be hungry. There's going to be pestilence. There's going to be plagues. There's going to be wild beasts, poisonous serpents, and also there's going to be war. So their land is going to be cursed. There's going to be famines that's going to prevail. This is one of the arrows that's in the quiver. The burning heat, there's not going to be any showers to cool the atmosphere. And, the earth is going to be hot. They're going to be, very uncomfortable. And there's not going to be any way to get any type of relief. There's nothing worse than a really hot day and being in a place where you just can't get any relief. There's no shade. The ground's hot. Your feet are hot. And you're just absolutely miserable. And then we see here that the bitter destruction, these plagues, this is another one that he was going to be using. And the teeth of the beast and the poison of the serpents, the beasts of the fields will multiply and destroy them. And this was, another one that had the poisonous serpents that infected their steps and were always around kind of to bite them and produce a lot of anguish and disease and things along that line. So we see here at least 5 arrows that God is going to use against the children of Israel. And then added to all of these, in verse 25 here, where he's talking about war. In verse 25 it said, the sword without and the terror within shall destroy both the young man and the virgin, the suckling also the man of gray hairs. That's the King James Version, and the Revised Version says, without shall the sword bereave, and the chamber's terror, it shall destroy both young men and virgin, and the suckling with the man with gray hair. So basically, all of these things that we've talked about in verse 24 is going to be compounded by the evils of war, which is going to sweep through from the inside and also from the outside. And the word that's used here in the original text talks about a sudden moral terror. So not only is there a physical situation that they're going to be running into, but they're also going to be running into a moral crisis also. And again, we see here, nobody is going to escape. The old, the young, everybody is going to be affected by this. Now, it's kind of interesting to read how this is taken by some of the scholars. Some of the scholars take kind of a short-term view and just kind of run it along slowly, but some of them take this all the way to the siege of Jerusalem with the Romans. And they talk here about the sword without. And this is the siege that the Roman army is besieging and destroying the city of Jerusalem. And then the terror within. And this terror within is talking about all of the things that are going on inside of the inside of Jerusalem while the Romans are doing their siege. And one of the purposes of having a siege is to make it so miserable for the people on the inside that they want to surrender. They cut off their water supply. They cut off their food supply. They do everything that they possibly can. And if you study, one of the things that more in the Middle Ages than the deal with Jerusalem was a lot of these cities would have moats around it. So what they would do, that moat was also not only for protection, but it was their water supply. And what they would do is they would kill animals and they would put the animals in the moat. And basically what that would do would be poison their water supply. So it's a bad situation. And what's going to happen is you're going to have people in there. We've talked about this earlier in Deuteronomy, where things got so bad that there was cannibalism. Moses has talked to these people about this before, and we're seeing it again here, that there's not going to be any place to go and escape from this, even in the bedchamber. That this is going to be, there's going to be terror and horror there because of all the things that are going around with this war. So no one is going to escape, and even the young men will probably be trying to fight the battle, and the old men are basically they're unable to defend themselves, and there will be given no reverence once the enemy comes in, just because they're old and maybe affirmed, and they maybe have some type of reverence with their people. The enemy is not going to care about any of those people. They don't care about the kids. They don't care about the men or the women or the old people, whatever. This is going to be a complete and total situation. There's going to be a lot of carnage as a result of this. And we've talked here a little bit about the siege of Jerusalem, but just think of all the times that the children of Israel were taken into captivity, and that was not a good situation either. And they talk about brutal things that happen now. Back when the children of Israel were taken into captivity, it was a brutal situation. I really don't think we have a good concept of how brutal these enemies were against the children of Israel. Things, we're appalled by things now. We would really be appalled by the things that were happening then. Comments about those verses?
A couple of things. First
okay.
The second phrase there in verse 23, God's telling Israel that I'm not going to hold back, because he says that I'm going to spend my arrows against you. He said, I'm not just taking a couple arrows out of a quiver. I'm spinning them.
Right.
They're gone. It's like emptying the chamber in the gun. God's doing that. And then, how many times as we've studied this in Deuteronomy does he bring up Egypt? Does he bring up how I delivered you from Egypt? What did I do to Egypt? What he's describing here shows that Egypt for the Egyptians was an inconvenience. Yeah, they had people die. Yeah, they had the firstborn die. Yes, they were inconvenienced, but we're talking total destruction here.
And that's what pretty much the siege of Jerusalem was, the end of the total destruction. I mean, that was when if you want to pick up one event that's going to completely wipe out the Jewish religion as it was known then, that was pretty much the event. Okay, let's look at verses 26 through 28. I don't think we'll get through these, but we'll give it a shot here. It says, I said I would scatter them into the corners. I would make the remembrance of them to cease from among men. Were it not that I feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversaries should behave themselves strangely, and lest they should say, our hand is high, and the Lord hath not done this. For they are a nation void of counsel, neither is any understanding in them. So in the jealousy for his honor, he is not going to make a full end of the children of Israel, yet. It can't be denied, but that they deserve to be utterly ruined, and their remembrance should be made to cease from among the men, so that the name of Israel would never be known in history. God didn't take it that far. We still know about the children of Israel and the nation of Israel and all that. So it wasn't to the point where he said he would scatter them, and he would make their he would make their remembrance. But here's the thing about it: God was going to use other methods rather than a direct method. He had the ability to strike people dead. That's not what he was going to do. He was going to use other nations to be his instrument to do this. And one of the things we've kind of mentioned this before. Every nation that he used against the children of Israel, in the end, they were punished also. They didn't get it scot-free. And God did not want them to think that it was their power that was allowing them to do this. He wanted to make it clear to them that it was his power and his hand that was going to do the destruction. It would have been very easy for God to have brought them to ruin and completely bring them out of taken them out of the remembrance of man. In other words, today we would have no recollection, and they would never even be on our radar screen that there was ever a nation of Israel. And he was cutting them off, and he could destroy those, but he didn't. And justice demanded that these things happen, but he was not going to go to the point where he was going to allow the people that were his instrument to say that it was their hand, because even though they did it for a while, it was going to be pointed out to them by their destruction that they were going to be able to, or they were going to end up the way that they did. Adam Clarke made an interesting comment. Of course, one of the things that Adam Clarke did, he was a very good translator of the scriptures, and he had a vast knowledge of the language at the time. He contends that verse 27 should be translated, "Indignation for the adversity deters me, lest their enemies should be alienated and say, the strength of our hand and not of the Lord's has done this." So whether that is the interpretation or not, that's a good description of what is being talked about here. It wasn't the strength of their hand, and they can't come back and say it wasn't the Lord. And had not God punished them in such a way as to prove that his hand and not the hand of man had done it, the heathens would have boasted about their power, and Jehovah then would have been blasphemed as not being able to protect the worshipers or to punish the infidels.
God's basically saying, "Don't be fooled. It was all me."
Right.
It's not what these people might say. It was all me.
And he also stated some writings that apparently Titus, who obviously led the siege of Jerusalem, there were some writings there that he basically acknowledged that God could not have not taken the city of Jerusalem without the hand of God in his on his side. They would have never been able to take it because the city of Jerusalem was so strong. So even Titus, who was basically a heathen, he even acknowledged the fact that I'm not sure that he understood that it was Jehovah God that was doing it, but there was some God involved in his ability to take the city of Jerusalem at the time. So the enemy would misread sometimes what's going on here, but it was not their power, but it was God's power that allowed this to happen. And in consideration of this, mercy prevails for the sparing of the remnant and the saving of that unworthy people that from utter ruin. There was lots of times before Jerusalem was destroyed, and when the children of Israel were in captivity, there was lots of opportunity for God to completely wipe them off the face of the earth, but he didn't, because he was merciful, and they finally came back to do the things that God wanted them to do. So we'll stop there, and we'll pick up next week with verse 29. So I appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.